Hey everyone, can you hear me? Awesome, great. So my name is Shelby Switzer. I live in the US, New York and Colorado. I work for a company called Healthify. Before I begin, who has seen the movie Home Alone? Oh, good, thank goodness. So I realized last night that I was going for a Home Alone theme with my talk, but that some of the slides have guns in them, and I didn't want to seem like, that kind of bothered me. But it's just a reference to the movie, and there's toy guns. So, I believe you, but my enterprise don't. Or, that's not gonna work. Or that's not gonna work. Adopting API best practices in enterprise healthcare. So, before we begin, just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I am the head of integrations at Healthify. We're a healthcare company in the US. We're about 5 years old. We have about 40 employees. We're a startup, and we're really exciting and excited. Formerly, I've been doing engineering and IoT, civic tech, and education. I've taught software engineering at a boot camp. And throughout my entire career, I've been really focused on APIs, and especially open data, and how we can build APIs and data networks for open and civic data. So at Healthify, one of the things that we have to face working with enterprise healthcare clients is that they have this integrations mentality. And that's something I don't really hear a lot about at conferences like this. Specifically, what I mean by that is we work with an enterprise client. They say, I want to integrate with your system in this way. We're going to do this build out. You're going to do that build out. Here's the implementation plan. And we're going to pay you like $100,000 to do it. And that sounds great, except that it's pretty terrible in terms of API best practices. It means that we don't really have a lot of control in how people are using our system. The client dictates a lot. It's expensive, it's costly, it's hard to maintain. We're going to talk more about that later. So what we've been trying to do at Healthify is move from an ad hoc custom integrations approach to having a real API and having it as part of our product offering for these clients. And that constitutes a really big mental shift for our clients. So when we work with them and we're trying to get them to see our approach and try and get them on board with this API mentality, these are the 3 things that we've learned how to do. Align technical success with user success, use open standards and talk about using them, and not just settling for documentation, but also guiding and teaching the technical teams. So, to begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Healthify and why we're here, what we do, and how this applies to APIs. So there's more to health than healthcare. And I don't mean that there's APIs and there's tech and there's data. Obviously, those things go into healthcare. What I mean specifically is that there are social determinants that impact a patient's health. So let's talk about Kate. Kate has a really stressful family, as I'm sure you know if you've seen the movie. And let's say that one day, Kate, she's a single mom, she's got 2 kids, she's working overtime to help pay the bills, and then one day her own father gets sick, so now she's a caregiver for him. She can't afford to pay a live-in nurse or anything, so he moves into the house and she starts taking care of him. And then one day at work, she just collapses. And her manager sends her to the emergency room. She goes there, and she gets diagnosed with hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar. And it's not because she's diabetic or she has a history of problems related to blood sugar, but more that she just forgot to eat. She was too busy taking care of other people, she didn't have the funds to outsource that, and she forgot to take care of herself. So that's what we mean when we talk about the social determinants of health. It's all the things that go into your life that impact your ability to take care of yourself and impact your health. Not even take care of yourself, but there are other stressors that go into your physical condition. So, Healthify tries to address social determinants of health by having a product that essentially has these 4 features. We have a search database, so we have to do a lot of data management, data curation, scraping, et cetera, to get a bunch of data in our database for social services in your area. So hyper-localized, super categorized. We have a taxonomy team who categorizes things based on eligibility, et cetera, so that maybe we can refer Kate to an elderly care center for her dad that's low cost or free. Maybe we can also get her some job assistance or some financial assistance or after-school care for her kids. We also have patient management, so we're getting patient data in and out of the system. You can see your patient's history. We have surveys to help you assess Kate's other needs. Maybe she needs more than what she's telling you at the hospital that day. And we also have referral coordination. So this is a pretty big thing. This is where we're trying to actually coordinate between health systems and the actual social services so that our users are the nonprofits, they're the government agencies, and they're the organizations in the community who are getting the referrals and actually responding back so that we can see the life cycle of care for the patient. So this puts us as HealthFi in a really unique position. We're integrating both with enterprise health IT systems, but also the tech that our community resources use. As you can see, and I've tried to illustrate this with these sort of anonymous database icons, we have Epic, we have EHRs, we have huge enterprise systems, we have custom proprietary ones that we're having to work with, many that you just wouldn't know the name of, other ones that are quite big in the US. But we're also integrating with SaaS products like Salesforce or email or Excel or Google Apps. And obviously, you can see which ones are easy to integrate with and which ones aren't. So why are the SaaS products easier to integrate with? Any ideas? Yes?
They were designed for it.
They were designed for it, yeah. So that's a good one. So they have APIs. They were designed to be used both in an API way as well as a kind of product GUI way. And they're designed to really be part of a workflow. Now, the enterprise healthcare IT systems, not designed this way. They were designed to be this big, like, service system that does everything, and they're just now starting to realize over the past 5 to 10 years that they really have to start integrating with other systems. And that's really hard for someone like us, a nice, cool startup trying to break into these spaces. And it's also really difficult because the ones circled in red, they have people behind them. They have teams that we have to work with. The ones in green, we never talk to those developers. We don't talk to those teams. There's just an API, there's documentation, there's tools. Maybe there's some support if we need help. But in general, it's just one-sided. We can get it done. We don't have to work with people because people make things really difficult. They have their own ideas. They have their way of doing things. And sometimes that we found in enterprise, their mentality is that we're going to do it their way, or we're not going to do it at all, and they don't want us at all. And so then, sometimes I feel like this. It becomes into this war between integrations versus APIs, and we're trying to get away from this custom integration mentality and say, hey, we just want to be a SaaS product too. We just want to have an API. You can integrate with it. We're going to work with you on the workflows, and we're going to think well about the design of the API that we're building. But they're not convinced. So before I begin talking about how we get them there, I want to just briefly touch on why APIs are better than an integration mentality. They're reusable, they're maintainable, scalable, innovatable. I know that's not a word, but I like patterns more than rules. So does anyone disagree with this? Good, okay. Awesome. Like having people who agree with me. So to put it simply, though, an API is one contract that we have to worry about. Integrations with enterprise clients is n number of contracts. And I don't want that from a business perspective, and I definitely don't want that from a software perspective. So how do we convince our client? It's obvious from a vendor perspective why we want to do this. But the client's always right, and they don't want to do it our way unless we do some hard work. So the first thing that we do is we try to align technical success with user success. When we first start integration conversations with our clients, we often are forced to come in at a later stage after they've done some of this product discovery, after they've done some of the user discovery, and they just want to talk about the technical details. And they want to talk about how we're going to measure technical success and how we're going to do this well. And what this really comes down to in a lot of these conversations is time to launch and cost to implement. There are other ways that you can measure technical success, like reusability or reliability, uptime, even test coverage could be a cool one. But the clients don't really care about that, so we talk mostly about how long is it going to take to do this and how much is it going to cost me in my contract. So this is really crappy because obviously you can't have fast, cheap, and good. So what happens is that we tend to forget about the user, and we build integrations that aren't great. So when we start to reposition the conversation with our clients, we try to talk about user success. How are we going to make the user happy? And then how is that going to relate to technical success? So ways that we measure user success, at Healthify we use Net Promoter Score, NPS. Some of you may use it, especially in the product circles, really thinking about user interface, but it's just as applicable in the API space. It's a way to determine how much users like your product, how they'd recommend it to other people. And then also ways we can quantify it are through the number of steps reduced, how many things are we getting rid of in our workflow that we're building, and then ultimately time to complete a successful workflow. This is really important. You have to determine what is a successful workflow, like what makes a user successful at the end of the day by using your API through an integration or a workflow, or even just using your product. And for Healthify, for us, that means time to help. How long is it going to take a social worker working with Kate at the hospital to identify her needs, to search and find some assistance for her, refer her to those, and then make sure that she's getting the care she needs? So with APIs, maybe we can start to have a balance between fast, cheap, and good. An API approach means that we have an increased time to launch. We don't have to build anything out for the client. We have a lower cost. It's out of the box. Maybe we can have a licensing structure, build the kind of monthly recurring costs into the price of the product overall. And then also, this is kind of a key one, in terms of thinking about the users, we can think about things such as real-time capabilities and good design. So I bring in real-time because everybody's like, well, duh, things should be real-time. But if you've ever worked with enterprise clients, you know that a lot of their status quo is just doing nightly or weekly or monthly file transfers. And that's obviously not real-time. So this is something that we have to bring up in conversation a lot, and it's something that is a good selling point for encouraging people to do things our way instead of the old-fashioned custom integration way. I do want to touch on design because it's pretty important. I think this goes back to what some of the previous speakers were talking about in terms of RESTful API design. If you are just exposing your data model through your API, you're not thinking about design, and you're not designing a good API, and you're going to run into problems that have been discussed already. So make sure that you're designing your API. Maybe even just pick one of your enterprise clients or partners to work through a beta API program with you so you can design and figure out your users and your workflows and build for reality and design a good API. And also, ultimately, at the end of the day, enterprise companies are starting to realize that they're having to compete with SaaS products. Their users use great products in their personal life, and they're starting to expect those things at work. So this is also a really good selling point. It's a really good way to convince executives that user experience really matters, and to do that, an API-first approach is pretty critical. So maybe you've gotten some traction in the negotiation process and the contract, and maybe business is on board. And the next thing that you can do to try and convince them to think of your API as a product itself is to use open standards and talk about how you use them. So open standards, they come with documentation, they come with guiding resources online. People talk about them. So you're already getting a support network when you sign on to open standards. So open standards are also really great working with clients because they act as a neutral contract. They help you hold your team accountable, they help your client hold you accountable, and they help your client hold their own technical team accountable by saying, like, hey, this is what everybody's agreed on, this is industry standard, and it's a good thing to be doing, so let's make sure we're doing it, and then it makes implementation much simpler. And they also lend you their authority. So it makes you look like you know what the industry is doing if you can reference open standards that you're complying with, that you're encouraging their teams to comply with as well. And it even really helps if you get involved in being a stakeholder in these open standards. So one thing at Healthify that we do is we get involved in open standard discussions, and we're helping to define some of them in the social services space. So let's say you've now convinced the business, you've convinced maybe even the technical managers that this is what we're going to do. We're not going to do a custom implementation. They're going to consume your API. Everything's going to be wonderful. And then it gets down to the technical team. So the developers who have been building these custom integrations for 20 to 30 years, they don't really have much experience working with modern web APIs. And they also don't really care that much about documentation. Because frankly, they've never had to before, because they've just worked on designing and implementing in tandem over email with the vendor. So just by a raise of hands also, who here, when you first are starting to use an API, who reads the documentation first? who just makes a curl request? Who does something else that I'm not aware of? Okay, cool. Yeah, exactly. So I just make a curl request and start playing around. Unless there's some weird authentication stuff I have to get around, and then I might look at documentation. And most certainly the people that we work with do not care about documentation. We have great documentation, interactive, we use apiary, it's beautiful, but the clients just couldn't care less, and their tech teams will never use it. Well, the business people love it. Tech teams don't care. So as an example of one way that you can start to guide your external technical team on how to use your API is this simple patient resource. So I've got Kate McAllister, she's got an ID, and then we've got 2 fields that are null. And this is a problem because I, as the consuming developer, have no idea what data types these are going to be. And I could go read the documentation, but more than likely, I'm probably just going to make an assumption that they're strings, because that seems normal, I guess. And we'll just build out our first implementation, assuming these are strings, based on this first data that we've gotten back in our first initial curl request. Maybe I'll do a couple more, and it just happens to be that all the data has null income or address. But then the next day, my data changes. I suddenly have an address for Kate, and it's not a string, it's an object with 2 fields. And like maybe it should also have a state or a country or a zip code, but right now it doesn't. So this is problematic because it's just broken my first assumption about the API, it's broken my first implementation, and then my next step as a developer is probably to go email the vendor's technical team and say, hey, your API sucks. Like, no, it doesn't, you just didn't read the documentation. But from our perspective too, we have to take this as feedback and say, how can we make the API more intuitive so that the documentation is not necessarily like the only resource that the external technical team can use. And we still have a problem. Our income is still null. We don't have any idea what that is. So the first step is just try to minimize nulls where possible. Use empty objects, use empty arrays instead of nulls. This just makes it also easier to consume and build more robust clients. But in cases where you can't do that, because income could be an integer, could be a string, you can't really have a null integer unless it's 0, but that has meaning. So one thing that we can start to think about is how can we be more self-descriptive? So how can we build an API response that tells me about the data structure behind the response or how to consume it, rather than just having a bunch of data that I don't really understand and I have to make assumptions about or read documentation for. So this example is a slightly modified version of collection JSON, which is a hypermedia format. And it simply I've only modified it to simplify it for the purposes of the screen. But you can see that I've got all my fields here. I've got a link to where the resource lives. And then I've also got my data types available so that I, as a developer, know exactly what I'm working with and I don't have to go anywhere else but the API response. Because one thing that we found in practice and also philosophically is that the API documentation that matters the most is the response. So maybe at this point, the enterprise is starting to buy into this. The technical team is on board. They're starting to learn best practices. They're starting to figure out that it is easy to consume some of these APIs if they're designed well and they guide instead of just document. We're using open standards, and we're trying to make sure that whatever we do in integrations, whether we still end up having to do some sort of custom thing because the client's really huge and it's hard to say no, or we're just building an API from scratch, we have to think about the end user. We have to think about who's ultimately using this integration, what's their workflow, and what does success look like. Cool. Thanks.